Adrienne Cole had been sitting at table 12 for 37 minutes, watching her Bordeaux catch the amber glow of candlelight, while couples around her laughed over shared plates and intertwined fingers. The restaurant hummed with the kind of warmth she'd forgotten existed, soft jazz drifting through exposed brick walls, the scent of rosemary and brown butter hanging in the air like a promise. This was her third blind date this year, carefully orchestrated by well-meaning friends who insisted she just hadn't met the right person yet. She was starting to think the right person didn't exist. Then a man burst through the door, hair wild from the wind, flannel shirt dusted with what looked like sawdust, boots scuffing against polished hardwood. He collapsed into the chair across from her, breathless and apologetic. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare, and my son needed help with his science project." Adrienne opened her mouth to say he had the wrong table. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or the way his calloused hands fidgeted with the menu, or simply the fact that this felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. So instead, she smiled, and everything changed. Adrienne had built her entire adult life around control. Stonebridge and Associates, the interior design firm she'd founded at 26, had become one of Portland's most sought-after names in luxury residential and commercial spaces. Her office overlooked the Willamette River, all clean lines and carefully curated artwork that whispered success without shouting. Her condo in the Pearl District matched the aesthetic, minimalist, sophisticated, everything in its proper place. But lately, when she came home to that perfect space, the silence felt less like peace and more like emptiness. She'd wake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. Professional triumph, personal void. Her best friend Nina had orchestrated tonight's blind date with the enthusiasm of someone who believed love could be engineered like a good blueprint. Raymond Keller, Nina had gushed over coffee last week. Venture capitalist, ran 2 marathons last year, loves theatre. Perfect for you, Adri. Adrienne had learned to smile and nod. Nina meant well. They all did. But sitting across from men whose accomplishments read like resumes had started to feel like interviewing candidates for a position nobody really wanted to fill. She'd dated the corporate lawyer who talked about billable hours over appetizers, the tech entrepreneur who checked his phone between every bite, the surgeon who seemed more interested in his own reflection in the wine glass than in anything she had to say. They were successful, attractive, appropriate, and they bored her to tears. She checked her phone. 39 minutes now. The text from Nina had arrived 20 minutes ago. "Raymond running late. Stuck in meeting. He's so sorry. Promise he's worth the wait." Adrienne had ordered the wine more as a prop than anything else, something to do with her hands while she contemplated whether leaving would seem desperate or dignified. Around her, the restaurant pulsed with life she felt disconnected from. A couple at the next table fed each other bites of chocolate torte, laughing at some private joke. An older pair sat in comfortable silence, their hands clasped between them like they'd been doing this for decades and still hadn't tired of it. She envied them that ease, that certainty. At 32, she'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish professionally. But moments like this reminded her that success looked different at 3 in the morning than it did in boardrooms and magazine features. She was reaching for her purse, ready to cut her losses and order takeout on the way home, when the door flew open with enough force to turn heads. The man who entered looked like he'd been in a fight with the weather, and lost. His dark hair stood up in odd angles, like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. The flannel shirt he wore, forest green and well-worn, had a fine coating of pale dust across the shoulders and sleeves. His jeans were faded at the knees, and his boots, though clean, had clearly seen years of hard use. He scanned the restaurant with an urgency that suggested he was very, very late for something important. His eyes landed on her table. on her. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other across the warm, crowded space. Then he was moving toward her, weaving between tables with the kind of unconscious grace that came from physical work, not gym memberships. "Sorry," he said again, as he dropped into the chair, pulling it closer to the table with a scrape of wood on wood. "I know I'm late. Traffic on the Burnside Bridge was completely backed up, and then Felix, my son, he remembered at the last possible second that his science project is due tomorrow, and he needed help figuring out how to make a volcano actually erupt instead of just sort of fizzle." He was talking fast, the words tumbling over each other like he'd been rehearsing apologies the entire drive over. "I got here as fast as I could. I really appreciate you waiting." He finally looked at her properly, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or surprise. I'm sorry. Have we met before?" Adrienne's mind was racing. This man thought he knew her, or was supposed to meet her, but she'd never seen him before in her life, which meant he had the wrong table, the wrong person. She should tell him, should explain that he was probably looking for someone else, that she was waiting for someone named Raymond, who apparently valued business meetings more than punctuality. But the words stuck in her throat, because something about this felt different. The way he'd mentioned his son so naturally, like single parenthood was just a fact of his life, not something to hide or apologize for. The genuine distress in his voice about being late. The dust on his clothes that suggested real work, not the theoretical kind that happened in front of computer screens. She made a decision that surprised her even as she made it. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We haven't met. Not officially." She extended her hand across the table. "I'm Adrienne." His handshake was firm, his palm warm and rough with calluses. "Lucas Brennan." The relief on his face was almost comical. "Thank God. I was worried I'd completely blown this before it even started. Mr. Patterson was really insistent about meeting tonight to discuss the cabinet specifications for his home office renovation, and I couldn't afford to reschedule. This is the biggest project I've landed in months." He finally seemed to register his surroundings properly, glancing around at the restaurant's upscale ambiance with a slight grimace. "This place is nice. Really nice, I have to admit. When Patterson suggested meeting here, I was a little surprised. I mean, I usually do project consultations at my workshop or the client's property, but I figured maybe he wanted to discuss things over dinner, make it more casual." Adrienne felt something click into place. He thought she was a client, or connected to a client. This wasn't a date for him at all. It was a business meeting. She should correct him right now, should explain the mix-up before this went any further. But then the waiter appeared at their table, a young man with impeccable posture and an eager smile. "Good evening. Can I start you both with still or sparkling water? And would you like to hear about tonight's specials?" Lucas glanced at the menu the waiter handed him, and Adrienne watched something shift in his expression. Not panic, exactly, but a kind of quiet recalibration. His eyes scanned the prices. She saw them widen almost imperceptibly, and then he looked back at her with a smile that was just a fraction too bright. "Water's fine for me." "Still," Lucas said. "And I think I'm good with just looking at the menu for now." The waiter nodded and glided away, and Lucas returned his attention to her. "So, Patterson mentioned you'd have some specific ideas about the aesthetic you're going for. I brought some samples of different wood types and finishes in my truck if you want to see them after we eat. I've been working primarily with maple and walnut lately, but I can source pretty much anything if you have something particular in mind." Adrienne should have stopped it right there. Should have said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." But she found herself leaning forward instead, genuinely curious. "What made you get into woodworking?" The question came out before she could second-guess it, and she saw him blink in surprise. Probably not the response he'd expected from a client, but he recovered quickly, and when he smiled this time, it reached his eyes. My grandfather, actually. He had this workshop in his basement, nothing fancy, just a table saw and some hand tools. But the things he could make, God, they were beautiful. Rocking chairs that fit your body perfectly, bookshelves that seemed to grow out of the wall, jewelry boxes with hidden compartments. When I was a kid, I'd spend hours down there with him, learning how to read the grain of the wood, how to feel when a joint was just right. He always said that wood had memory, that you had to respect what it wanted to be, not just force it into the shape you had in mind. There was something in the way he talked about his grandfather, a warmth and reverence that made Adrienne's chest tighten. This wasn't rehearsed networking speech. This was real passion, the kind that came from a place deeper than career ambition. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," she said softly. Lucas nodded, his smile turning bittersweet. "He was. Passed away when I was 19. Left me all his tools. They're still the ones I use most often, actually. There's something about working with the same planes and chisels he used, you know? Like he's still there, guiding my hands." He cleared his throat, seeming suddenly self-conscious. "Sorry. I tend to get a little sentimental about this stuff. My wife, ex-wife, used to say I loved those tools more than—" He stopped abruptly, and Adrienne saw pain flash across his face before he shuttered it. "Anyway, that's how I got started." The ex-wife comment hung in the air between them. Adrienne wanted to ask, wanted to know the story behind that particular hurt, but she could sense it was too raw, too soon. Instead, she said, "It's not sentimental. It's beautiful. We live in a world where everything's disposable, mass-produced. The idea that you're keeping that craftsmanship alive, that connection to the past, that matters." She meant it. In her work, she'd seen too many spaces filled with furniture that looked impressive in photographs but had no soul, no story. Pieces that could have come from anywhere, meant nothing to anyone. Lucas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or something like recognition. "That's exactly it," he said quietly. "Most people just want to know how fast I can deliver, and what's the bottom line. They don't really care about the process, about why certain joints are stronger than others, or why quarter-sawn oak ages differently than plain sawn. But that's the whole point. The care you put into making something, that's what makes it last." They fell into conversation then, the kind that flowed without effort. Lucas told her about his workshop, a converted garage space in southeast Portland, where he worked alone most days, radio playing old country stations while he measured and cut and sanded. He talked about the satisfaction of transforming raw lumber into something functional and beautiful, about the meditative quality of repetitive tasks done well. Adrienne found herself sharing things she rarely discussed with clients or even friends. How she'd started her business with nothing but a portfolio of student work and an unhealthy amount of confidence. How she'd nearly gone bankrupt twice in the first 3 years. How she still sometimes walked into rooms she'd designed and felt like an imposter waiting to be found out. "But you made it work," Lucas said. "That takes guts. Starting something from nothing, betting on yourself like that." Adrienne shrugged, uncomfortable with the admiration in his voice. Or stupidity. The line's pretty thin sometimes. Their waiter returned, poised to take their order. Adrienne watched Lucas scan the menu again, saw the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. The entrees ranged from $35 to $60, and while that was standard for Portland's upscale dining scene, she suddenly understood it represented a calculation for him. How many hours of work? How many projects? She thought of the dust on his shirt, the calluses on his hands, the pride in his voice when he talked about his craft. "You know what?" she said suddenly. "I'm not actually that hungry for a full meal. Would you be okay if we just did appetizers? I had a late lunch." It was a lie, smooth and easy. She'd barely eaten today, too nervous about the blind date, but she saw relief flicker across Lucas's face, even as he protested. "You sure? I mean, if you're hungry, don't let me—" She cut him off with a smile. "I'm sure. The burrata here is supposed to be incredible. And maybe the grilled octopus we could share?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "That sounds great, actually. Felix and I usually eat pretty early, so this works better anyway." He ordered for both of them, his voice more relaxed now, and Adrienne felt an odd satisfaction at having smoothed over that moment of discomfort. When the waiter left, Lucas leaned back in his chair, really looking at her for the first time since he'd arrived. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it's none of my business." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a concerning preface, but go ahead." He grinned, and the expression transformed his face, made him look younger and mischievous. "Why would someone like Patterson hire someone like you to consult on custom cabinets? No offense, but you don't exactly seem like the type to be worried about dovetail joints and drawer slides." The question caught her off guard. Someone like you. What did he think she was? More importantly, what was she doing, letting this continue? She'd gone from sitting alone at a table, ready to give up on the whole evening, to actively participating in a case of mistaken identity. This was absurd, irresponsible, completely unlike her. "Actually," she said slowly, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke, "I think there might be some confusion here." Lucas's smile faded slightly, replaced by polite puzzlement. "Confusion about what?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed against the table. She glanced down at the screen. Nina. "OMG, Adari. I'm so sorry. Raymond just called. He's not coming. Apparently he met someone at his meeting and forgot he was supposed to meet you. Can you believe it? I'm going to kill him. Are you okay? Want me to come get you?" Adrienne stared at the message, feeling something between laughter and disbelief bubble up in her chest. Raymond had stood her up, not because of traffic or an emergency, but because he'd met someone else and simply forgotten about her. It should have stung, should have felt like rejection. Instead, she felt lighter, like a decision had been made for her. She looked up at Lucas, who was watching her with concern. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, and meant it. She turned her phone face down on the table. "Actually, everything's better than fine. I just realized that whoever you think I am, whoever you're supposed to be meeting here, I'm not her. Or him. I don't know, Mr. Patterson. I was here for a blind date that apparently just cancelled on me." She watched comprehension dawn on Lucas's face, followed quickly by horror. He pushed back from the table slightly, hands raised in a gesture of apology and dismay. "Oh God. Oh no. I'm so sorry. I just assumed. The table, the timing, I thought you were—" He looked around the restaurant wildly, as if his actual client might materialize. "I should go. I need to find the right table. This is so embarrassing, I'm really sorry." But Adrienne was already shaking her head. She surprised herself with what she said next. "Don't go." Lucas froze, half standing. "What?" She met his eyes, saw her own recklessness reflected back at her, and smiled. "Stay. Please. My blind date forgot about me. You clearly got your tables mixed up. And in the last 20 minutes, I've had the most interesting conversation I've had in months. So stay. Let's start over." She extended her hand again, formal and absurd and perfect. "Hi, I'm Adrienne Cole. I run an interior design firm. I'm terrible at online dating, and I just got stood up by a venture capitalist I never wanted to meet in the first place." Lucas stared at her for a long moment. She could see him thinking, weighing, deciding. Then slowly, wonderfully, he smiled that real smile again and took her hand. "Lucas Brennan. I'm a carpenter, single dad to a 7-year-old science enthusiast, and I apparently can't read table numbers to save my life." They shook hands like it was the beginning of something, which maybe it was. When he sat back down, the awkwardness had shifted into something else. something that felt like possibility. "So," Lucas said, a hint of laughter in his voice, "what do we do now?" "Now," Adrienne said, feeling more certain than she had in years. "We figure out if this ridiculous beginning can turn into something real." The appetizers arrived then, beautiful and fragrant, and as they shared food and stories and something that felt remarkably like hope, Adrienne thought about all the carefully planned blind dates that had led nowhere, and how the best things in life, it seemed, were the ones you never saw coming. The Burnside Bridge glittered with reflected light as Lucas drove home that night, his mind replaying the evening in fragmented images that didn't quite feel real. Adrienne's smile when she'd asked him to stay, the way she'd listened when he talked about his work, not with polite patience, but genuine interest. How she'd insisted on splitting the bill despite his protests, telling him firmly that if this was going to be whatever it was going to be, they started as equals. He'd gotten her number, actually gotten the number of a woman who seemed successful and smart and funny and completely out of his league, a woman who apparently didn't care that he'd shown up covered in sawdust to a place where people probably spent more on wine than he made in a week. He pulled into the driveway of his small craftsman bungalow in the Woodstock neighborhood and sat for a moment in the cooling truck, trying to process what had just happened. The house was dark except for the living room lamp Mrs. Holland always left on when she watched Felix. She was his neighbor, a retired teacher who'd made it her mission to help Lucas navigate single parenthood after his wife walked out 3 years ago. Lucas didn't know what he would have done without her. Probably crashed and burned, if he was being honest. He found her on the couch, reading glasses perched on her nose, working through a crossword puzzle while late-night television played at low volume. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "Well, you're home earlier than I expected. Project consultation go badly?" Lucas felt heat creep up his neck. "Actually, there was a mix-up. I was at the wrong table. Met someone else entirely." Mrs. Holland's eyebrows rose with interest. "Someone else? And judging by that look on your face, someone interesting?" He couldn't help the smile. "Maybe. Yeah. She was... I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't supposed to be a date, but it kind of turned into one." Mrs. Holland closed her crossword book with a decisive snap. "Lucas Brennan, are you telling me you accidentally went on a date?" When he nodded, she let out a delighted laugh. "That's the best thing I've heard all week. What's her name?" They talked for a few minutes, Lucas finding himself sharing more than he'd intended about Adrienne, about how easy it had been to talk to her, how she'd made him feel like his work mattered. Mrs. Holland listened with the kind of attention that came from decades of working with young people, reading between the lines of what was said and what wasn't. "Just be careful," she said gently as she gathered her things to leave. "Felix is doing so well lately. I'd hate to see him get attached if this doesn't work out." The words were a cold splash of reality. Lucas nodded slowly. "I know. Trust me. I know." After she left, he checked on Felix, who was sprawled across his bed in the unconscious abandon of childhood sleep. His science textbook lay open on the nightstand next to a half-finished volcano made of papier-mâché. Lucas adjusted the blanket and smoothed his son's hair back from his forehead, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. Everything he did, every choice he made, it all came back to this kid. To making sure Felix grew up feeling loved and secure despite his mother deciding she wanted a different life. Rachel had left on a Tuesday morning, bags already packed, her face carefully blank. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said, and Lucas had known she meant all of it. The marriage, motherhood, the small house and smaller dreams. She'd wanted adventure, spontaneity, freedom. He'd wanted stability for their son. There hadn't been room to reconcile those things, and truth be told, Lucas didn't blame her for leaving. But he'd never forgive her for barely seeing Felix afterward, for reducing her own child to birthday cards and monthly support checks. Lucas had learned to be both parents, learned to braid hair and pack lunches and attend school conferences alone, had learned that love was often less about grand gestures and more about showing up, every single day, even when you were exhausted. Especially then. He couldn't risk bringing someone into Felix's life unless he was absolutely certain. Couldn't introduce his son to someone who might leave, who might make Felix feel abandoned all over again. But even as he thought it, Lucas remembered the way Adrienne had looked at him when he mentioned his son. Not with the usual polite disinterest of women who saw single dads as complications, but with something like respect, maybe even curiosity. He pulled out his phone before he could overthink it and typed a message. Made it home. My actual client just emailed, furious that I never showed up. Apparently table 18 is very different from table 12. Thanks for one of the strangest and best evenings I've had in a long time. He hit send before his doubts could catch up with him. Her response came faster than he expected. Table 18? Were we really that far off? I'm choosing to see this as fate having terrible eyesight. Same question back at you. Made it home okay? They texted back and forth for another 20 minutes, nothing deep or meaningful, just the kind of conversation that felt easy. She told him about her condo that she'd decorated but never really made a home. He told her about Felix's science project crisis and how they'd had to emergency run to the craft store for baking soda. It was normal, simple, and somehow that made it feel more significant than any of the elaborate first dates he'd stumbled through in the past 3 years. When he finally said goodnight and plugged in his phone, Lucas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about calloused hands and sawdust, and the way some mistakes turned out to be exactly right. Adrienne stood in her condo, still in her coat, looking at the space like she was seeing it for the first time. Everything here reflected back at her with careful perfection. The grey sectional positioned at optimal conversational angles. The abstract art chosen more for colour coordination than emotional resonance. The kitchen that looked like something from a magazine because she barely used it beyond morning coffee and takeout reheating. When had she stopped being a person and become a brand? When had her life become so curated that there was no room for mess, for spontaneity, for a man covered in sawdust sitting at the wrong table? She thought about Lucas's description of his grandfather's workshop, about working with old tools that carried memory and meaning. Everything in her space was new, bought specifically for this place, with no history beyond the price tag. She'd been so focused on building success that she'd forgotten to build a life. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like relief. Like maybe she'd been waiting for permission to want something different, something more. Her phone buzzed with Lucas's text about table 18, and she found herself grinning at the absurdity of it all. Fate with terrible eyesight. She liked that. Liked the easy humor, the lack of pretense. She texted back. And then they were talking again. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, her perfect apartment felt less like a museum and more like a place where someone actually lived.